Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
We'll go ahead and start Pat's talk. We have Dr. Patrick Manti from the University of California at Santa Cruz talking about his collaboration environment in one of his interesting classrooms.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm echoing now. I hear it very well. So, because I'm an opinionated professor who developed, I suppose, my opinions pretty early in my career, and that was when I was a very young faculty member at Stanford. I guess I could say that my first teaching experience at Stanford plus 40 years ago, I realized that I liked one particular room, and I've reflected on that room a lot because it had 9 blackboards. And I don't think I was a particularly good teacher, but I was a dynamic lecturer, and I always filled 9 blackboards in 50 minutes. And I liked the idea that I could fill those 9 blackboards, and at the end of the lecture I could go back and recapitulate exactly what we'd done, and it was all in front of the students. Now they were set up in, this was the physics lecture hall at Stanford. It had 3 rows of 3 boards, and you could see at least 6 of the 9 at any time. And I believed, and I still believe, and this is my values, that information in front of the students providing context was an important part of teaching. And over my years, I went off and spent 20-some years at IBM Research and then succumbed to returning to academia. I've done a lot of lecturing and a lot of teaching, and I've never forgotten those early experiences. And I've also learned as a professor, as a department chair, as others, that there's a lot of student reaction to teaching styles. And one of them is that, I say this at Microsoft with a certain degree of reverence, that PowerPoint presentations in the classroom are not generally seen by students as something that they have a great affection for. And I frankly don't think it's PowerPoint that's the problem. I think it's the way we present the material and what we expect the students to do. So I'm giving you all this preamble because I've been dreaming for years about how the teaching environment ought to work. Another thing I learned in my earliest teaching back in those very early days at Stanford was that we were teaching with students in industry as part of our class environment, and we had a video feed for them. The video feed was either the instructor or a document camera that was essentially seeing what I wrote. The student helper often wanted to put the camera on the instructor, and I had a switch that I could flip it back to show what I was talking about, because I considered it was much more important for them to see me writing what I wrote than what I looked like that morning, especially like this one where I banged my head on the cupboard and now looked like I was one of the walking wounded. So I've had a lot of trying with that. I've learned to really like that for another reason, which is one of the beauties of a PowerPoint presentation is I'm not looking at the board, I'm looking at you. And I have a value that's important. And I find a lot of my faculty colleagues don't, not all, but there are some who question me about that. I said, well, you're standing there writing on the board isn't really the most effective means of communicating or finding out what kind of response you're getting from the ideas that you're putting forward. So I've been dreaming over years of what should the classroom look like. And I've had the opportunity to spend some money at various times to develop several different classrooms, and I'm on at least the second or third one of those of what I think. So the current classroom that definitely reflects my values, a few of my faculty colleagues that I spend time talking with, and a bunch of students that are working with me, is, first of all, there will be no board, whiteboard or blackboard. And secondly, there'll be means of putting up material that will stay for some length of time. And more than just the current thing I'm talking about, unlike this one where I see this chart only. So we're going to have a large display space, and we're going to be able to use it in a variety of ways. And let me tell you, we're still trying to figure out how we do that and what's the most effective way. But I had, this is being recorded, I better be careful exactly how I say this, but I managed to get some laboratories under the research program we have at the University of California that's called CITRUS, which is Center for Information Technology Research in the Interests of Society. I'm the co-director I'm the director at the Santa Cruz affiliation of that with Berkeley and Davis and also Merced. And we had some building money, and I managed to get a new building. I was the dean at the time, and I got a new engineering building underway. And in the process, I got a 5th floor and about 15,000 square feet of research space under Citrus. But in that, I built a laboratory, which is a 100-seat room I'll show you in a minute, that looks an awful lot like a classroom, but it's a research lab. And so it's under my, so far, control. And I'm trying to equip it in ways that allow me to experiment with more effective ways of making a large class something other than a dismal experience where students sit there and with their heads down writing what the instructor puts up on the screen. So that's what I'm giving you a bit of. This is my motivation and goals, but my values. And as I've articulated these values to some colleagues, I get generally pretty good response from faculty colleagues. I've tried to measure this versus an age distribution, but I have no scientific data. It's not universal, but I find some colleagues want to do it the way they've always done it, which is to write with chalk on a chalkboard. And some of them say, my job is to put stuff on the board, and their job is to take it down. And I said, muttering under my breath, you ought to retire. Because I think one of the problems that let me tell you also background of where I come from. I'm an electrical engineer turned signal processing turned geographic database turned workstation architect. What I've been through it all, but I'm really at home at teaching in the areas of signals and systems, circuits, networks, things. And I love simulations. And I've actually learned more over the years how much simulations help give students some insight into complex concepts. I like the math, and I love to develop equations, and I used to lecture by filling the board with nice integral signs, and I still love those kind of classes. The introduction to signals and systems, or I teach graduate control systems, graduate digital signal processing, and I love all the pretty math, and I like to write integral signs and summation signs galore. But when you really want to understand this stuff, it seems to me a great help to be able to run a quick simulation. So in recent years, when I've taught, say, a control systems or a digital signal processing class, I have the students sitting there. Another one of my assumptions and values is students own laptops and they bring them to class. And for the ones that don't, we'll figure out a way to get them there. But practically everybody comes to class with a pretty powerful laptop. So I've had the students sitting there in a classroom, either with laptops or with a classroom full of computers, where they had MATLAB at their disposal. And I'd lecture on something to a certain point, and I'd say, now let me see how you decide this parameter, or how would you decide how this is going to work. Put together a simulation. I wander around the room and I look to see what people are doing. I remember in a control systems class, and I was teaching the introductory course, I had them simulate the shock absorber system on the front end of a car. Kind of gave the equations, we developed the notion of it, and I said, okay, simulate this. Now you figure out what value you want for the damping coefficient. So various people put various things in, and I went and I looked at this one guy's, and I said, wow, you got a 47 Lincoln with bad shocks. I mean, it's going, every time you hit a bump, it's going like this. Another guy, I looked at his, and I said, boy, this is a sports car and then some. And you hit a bump, and then it reset. Well, they had no idea what they were really doing, but when they start getting some feel for that, and then I'd have them gather around to look at this one, look at that. We changed this parameter, look how this changes. I think there's a lot more learning goes on in that than my development of the equations, as much as I love the math. So those are some of my values, some of my prejudices. But in a small class of 8 or 10 or 12 students, I could do that very effectively. How do I bring that same experience into a classroom of 100 seats so that the students learning some complex things can actually exercise it, get feedback from their peers and from the instructor, become part of the learning process? And one of my graduate students said, maybe we have this novel idea that you can actually make the classroom experience a learning experience rather than a note-taking experience. And that sounds like another radical motivation, but that's where we are. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, the other part of it, Richard isn't here today, but we've had a lot of enthusiasm for Presenter that he's developed, and we worked with it. And I've been playing with tablet PCs, and I know I'm a technology geek and I love to play with the latest toys, but I don't find my writing satisfies me when I write on a tablet. Some people are good at that, and I'm just not as comfortable. So I said I don't want a whiteboard and I don't want a blackboard, and I'm frustrated about the tablets. So now I'm back to document cameras. And I'm back to document cameras, but I don't like it turned into video, so I'm figuring out how to do that in a more cost-effective way so that I get that as a vector order list. I'm a computer graphics guy by one other background, and I want to put it back the way we used to do graphics way before we could afford bit buffer displays, get that stuff into a vector order list so I can manage it efficiently. So we're trying this various schemes of systems to do this. But the fundamental piece of all this is I've got a classroom that right now I have dreams of having n where n was large. Right now I have 4 displays. And I've got I also have, besides the 100-seater, I have 2 others. One is a 24 or 32-seat classroom, which will also have 4 projection displays, and then another small collaboration lab, which sits about 10 or 12 people. And so far, space is under my control. Until they get rid of me, I've got space to work and experiment. So that's the sort of preamble. That's probably more important than how I did it. But I'm really trying to get you to think about, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Tell me where my values are different from yours. Tell me what you think we ought to be able to do, or where I'm way off base. I get a little of this at home, and I don't think we have a good means of evaluating what we've got, but we want to make a better context, a better environment for students. Let me add one other anecdote. I remember a student, one of the things that I think I do have is a pretty good memory, especially for students and watching them behave in class. But one shocking experience I had was teaching a graduate controls course, which is pretty heavy math. And I had one guy sit there, just for the class, just sit there and look at me, and never took a note. And I thought, thank God, what's with this guy? Obviously, he just must be auditing. He's not really interested. And then I gave the first exam, and he was the highest grade in the class. And I realized that guy had somehow passed over first of all, he was obviously very smart, but he also had the confidence that he was engaging me. I was talking to him. I mean, I found that he was learning it on the fly. Other people were getting the notes, so they go off and learn it later. He was getting it in real time. Now, that was very efficient, and he was able to do that, and not every student is going to do that, but it fascinated me. It made me remember, my professor at Stanford was a guy named Bernie Widrow, who's the father of a lot of the neural networks early work, and a fine guy, but it took me years to appreciate him. And I remember a class I took from him when I was a first-year graduate student at Stanford, and I remember thinking, I have no notes in this class, practically. I just write a few things down. And I thought, he must not have taught much because my notebook was so thin. And I aced his exams, and I really was somewhat pejorative about his class not being all that hard. And then I realized over the years how many things I go back to, I learned that in that class, I learned that in that class. So somehow I synced with him so that what he was teaching me, I got. And I didn't need to go home and learn it, I got it. But I want to provide the student with the ability, the opportunity to take the risk of spending their time in class learning rather than time in class making sure they've captured everything so they can learn it later. And that's, I think, a really different situation than we generally offer. So I'm making the assumption that everybody comes with a pretty powerful computer, and if not, we'll have a rack of them so that HP's just given us 20 to put in the room so we can provide a machine to the students that don't. This is where I really get radical. I think that you might as well use that computer to capture what's up on the board rather than having to write it down. Now, students tell me, some of them tell me, and I talk to a lot of students. The older I get, the harder it is to get them to talk to me, but I get over that eventually. And they say, if you could give us the notes beforehand, we'd like it better. I said, yeah, and if I could fly, I'd like it better too. But you don't understand the just-in-time delivery applies to old professors who are, especially if you're teaching a class you haven't taught before and you get a new idea tonight and you want to make a better lecture tomorrow and you're writing the lecture notes, you don't have time to get those lecture notes presented to them beforehand and handed out. So even in my Stanford days, I used to capture what I wrote on the pad that was projected on the screen, and I duplicated those, the Ditto machine, and they got copies of them later. Now, at least, I'm going to have it up on the board. So the idea is that the student sitting in the seat can capture anything I put up on the board electronically, dynamically, by being hooked up to the network. That's all in some grand bit buffer in the sky that they can grab it and put it on their display. They can zoom in on it if they want. They can pan around. They can go back to things that have disappeared from the displays. And they can capture and then annotate anything they want. So if I'm standing up there saying, you better get this because this is how that homework problem works, or this is going to be on the midterm, I haven't written it down, they can put a note in there. They can also relate their thinking about what's important at the time, but they don't need to write down everything I wrote down. I mean, I just don't think that's sufficient. Now, I know very little about learning psychology. I know a lot of different people's opinions, and some people tell me that they learn a lot by writing the notes. And I don't doubt that. I mean, I think that if you sit down and rewrite something, it helps you learn it. But I don't necessarily believe that's the activity you should be doing while you're sitting in my class. If you find that's a good effective way of learning is to write your summary of the material later, go do it. I had an older brother who was a really good student and an engineer ahead of me, and I took some classes right behind him in the same program in the same school, sometimes from the same profs who seemed to give the same lectures. And my brother took notes and rewrote his notes. So I took his notes to class, and I'd look at the lecture, and I'd look at the notes, and yeah, I got that, yeah, I got that, yeah, I got that. I never took any notes in those classes. They were fun, because my brother had all the notes, and I just read his notes, and I listened to the lecture, and I was done. I made grades fine, and that wasn't any problem. I guess I'm still dreaming of providing students with that environment, because engineering students today are really loaded. And in some ways, I think they're loaded more than, those of us like to say what was really tough when I was young. But I ask my students, how many of you are working? And practically every hand goes up. And I ask, how many of you are working more than 10 hours a week? And the hands all stay up. Now, I don't know how you do that and make good grades in a challenging engineering curriculum. And anything I can do to make it a little better for them, not at the expense of them failing to learn the material, but rather that the classroom experience is more useful to them and more positive. So anyway, those are, as I realized I needed to articulate my values more clearly than I might have. I'm attempting to do that because that's really more important than exactly the implementation that I have. So that's what we're up to. We're trying to also allow in the big classroom, if I say, would one of you like to show me how you work that homework problem? And they want to put it up, I want to dynamically be able to let them, from their seat, put that up on a part of the display. Or if I say, here's an in-class challenge problem, let's see, take a few minutes and figure out how to do this. Who thinks they've got a neat solution? Or break them up into teams and let them work with each other and then put up their team solution. I've come to believe that those are effective ways of making large class environments more exciting than just sitting there. We also have, in our university, a structure of we teach 5-unit classes in a quarter system, which means the classes are an hour and a half. And then people want to switch to Tuesday, Thursday, and there'll be 2-hour sessions. Now, I don't really care how good of a lecturer you are or how much sleep you as a student have had the night before, but into 2 hours sitting there, this does not work. So you got to break it up. You got to make it, I feel like a stand-up comedian trying to keep them awake. But you've got to do something. Well, giving them an assignment and letting them work on it and getting some feedback helps make that happen. So graphics and simulation, big piece of my belief in areas that I teach in, but I'm sure there are plenty of other contexts. I know programming is a perfect one of that, where people work an example and see, let's see your code. So that's where I'm coming from. So the architecture we're after is we want to run some of the software on an instructor machine. Now, I still believe the instructor has to be in control. I mean, I'm old, I'm not going to hand over everything to the students. I'm in charge. It's my class. I remember the last class I was teaching computer networks in spring quarter, and I forget that I'm the older professor among the crowd, and when the students kind of get a little backed off, and some students said, "Are you going to give us a break?" Because it was one of those 2-hour classes. And I said to the students, "What do you think?" And then he said, "We get to vote on it?" I said, "What do you think, this is a democracy?" And it's kind of like, that was the end of that conversation. And then the students, some of them that knew me, sort of started laughing. I said, well, we'll see, depending, we'll try to break it up somehow. But I believe the instructor still has to run the show. That's what we're paid to do. But I also want the students to have control, so that if you want to see, what the heck was he talking about, 2 slides? Now, you can't do that here. You can if you have some of the software tools that Microsoft has, and we put this through that. But you can't do it now. You don't have this, and my slides aren't on your laptop. I want to be able to do that. I want you to be able to capture it. Do so. And we also have this ecumenical view down at the bottom that I get window. I think I lost an S there. I guess spell checker didn't care about that. But a variety of environments that the students can have. So we broke this up into 3 modes. There's the mode that's the control mode. That's where the instructor is. And that is also where you can do certain functions that only the instructor needs. There's what we call laptop presentation mode, which is really where I could yield the floor to anybody to be the presenter, and they then control from their seat if they want, without ever coming up and plugging their laptop in. They can control the display and put stuff up on any part of the display that I've yielded to them. And then there's this collaboration mode in which we extend that to where students can interact, and they put up pieces that would give them part of the real estate, and they can also capture things that are on the screen. This is very much a work in progress. My graduate student, Jeremy Richards, who's my co-author of this, is busy implementing our first version of this as his master's thesis. We've been experimenting with it in a couple of classes, and we'll be doing more of that this fall. But we have this first notion, which is this, that we have a a display environment which has 4 display spaces. We've got the room, my 100-seat room that has this, and the small classroom has room for 4 screens on the wall. In our case, we bent 2 of them just because of the way the architecture was in the big room. And we have, right now, we're using projection displays. We had thought originally I would get somebody to give me enough plasma panels to cover that with a tiled plasma panel. But so far my fundraising hasn't been successful, so I'm back to the conventional long throw lenses, putting it up on the wall. But what I have in mind here is that I think of the red screen there as sort of my thinking now as my conventional lecture style. That I lecture, the thing I'm talking about in full scale is on the red screen. When I finish with that, I may shove it over to the left screen, and the next thing I do goes on the right screen. And as I lecture, I will cascade this stuff over, and then I'll begin to start shrinking it into quarter size and into smaller size, but it's all up there in visible form. So you can see the entire set of things that I've gone through are all staying in front of you during the, all depending on how many charts I use, but at least a good piece of it. But more importantly than that, it's in a buffer that you can access by a wireless connection. I've also got 100 megabit Ethernet to every seat in that room when I got it wired. But so that you can go to it, and if you wanted to go back and grab one that I've shrunk down to a quarter size and you can't read it, or you're sitting in the back and you want to look at it bigger, you can bring it up on your laptop and use that as a window to look at it. And I still remember way back when I was a student, and I know many times when I sit in somebody else's lecture that about 3 slides later I realized I should have been paying attention to something back there and say, what the heck? Oh yeah. Well, now you can go back to it and you can catch that and say, oh, now I see the connection. That's what it's talking about. That's where that's going. So those are some of the things we want to facilitate that the student can easily do. You can iterate on the material at your own pace. You can go backward and forward, and you don't have to panic that you've got to write it all down because it's the only time you're ever going to see it, because it's all there. We also record it all, put it on a web server in addition, but I want you to be able to annotate it as it's up in front of you. So that's the kind of picture we have right now. Pretty conventional implementation from the point of view of four projectors filling the wall, and the buffering behind it is what makes it work. So the instructor mode is the authoritative one. That's the management mode. That's where you're in control. You, as an instructor, can lecture in conventional fashion, fill up the screens. You can also yield a piece of the display to somebody to put their stuff up for the rest of the class to see. You can also use it in a different mode, which is where my programming colleagues that are with me on this see that they could have students doing a small programming assignment. They could sit and look at each one of those assignments. You know, I can flip around and see what anybody, but not necessarily presenting it. And they then decide to present one that they think is interesting to show, or the student wants to show because they volunteered, or however you know, instead of having the good old days when I remember taking algebra and the instructor said, go up and work this problem, you know, the effective, you can say, I want to show the way I implemented that, or you can ask somebody to volunteer or otherwise. And we have some issues of values there. We're not mandating that you show the work. We're trying to make it so that the student has the ability to turn that on or off. If they don't want to participate, they don't. But of course, that's the same as I have in class. You either don't participate, and then I mentally take note this person doesn't participate in class, but at least it's your choice. It's not something that we're spying on you. So in the instructor mode, our major operations are that you can essentially control what's up on the screen. You manage that real estate, and you make it available to students if you want. You can show student work if they've given you permission, essentially running their VNC so that that data can be shown, and letting them launch displays. For instance, you know, this could be instructor mode, and the instructor's looking, and they've been doing some assignment, and 3 of them look like they were, and the 4th one was off someplace else looking at. Well, if they left themselves open to be looking at, so that the instructor could look at what they're doing, then they might wisely choose what they put up on the screen. And hope they're not looking at some site that they shouldn't. The laptop presentation mode is this one where you essentially, if the student had a project and you say, okay, show your project, you just essentially yield the floor to them, yield the screen, all or some section of it to them, and they present. I also dream of this for conferences when we wouldn't spend the time that I've often seen at meetings where we match up whether my machine will work with that projector, because you could essentially just run from anybody's machine without any wires. Of course, the problem is we have to load this software on the machine ahead of time, which is the VNC software. But this gives the control to that presenter. It also would, of course, keep any other people out. So you can, through the instructor mode, we control who has it and so forth. But this collaboration mode is the one where everybody under the control of the instructor, any subset of people can have certain pieces of the real estate to present their work. So you could think of breaking up the class up into small groups. I've worked some with John Canny at Berkeley. I looked at some of the things he's done in his means of developing in-class groups, and I like the idea, although it took me a while to get to come to understand how attractive that was. But if you had groups of students that were somewhat of a team, and you let each team work together on something, and you could have them presenting their work to themselves or to each other, each of them have a piece of the real estate. Those are pieces of what we hope this thing will allow us to do. We've also, of course, this ability to capture anything that's shown on the screen is what I've talked about. I've used Snagit here, should have their reference to theirs. I've gotten to like their little software for making charts and slides, and I say that's the kind of capability I want, so that's what it says here. And so that's basically the collaboration mode. So the student might be, grabbing this kind of stuff from a screen or showing it back and forth, and I won't spend a lot of dwell time on that. This is just example in those 4 screens. You might be allowed to go onto 1, 3, or 4, but not 2 because somebody else has 2. So there's you get an icon on your laptop as a student showing you what space you can have or what the instructor's assigned to you, and this is still a work in progress as to how you'd know what you're given. And the software support for this is using VNC, which we heard about in a couple of presentations, and you're, I think, probably all familiar with, and probably more familiar with than I am, since I'm waving my arms and students are doing the work. But the notion of having this ability to essentially dump the frame buffer into in and out of machines allows us to do this, we think, in a lot less bandwidth than we've looked at several different ideas, and there may be better ones. At first, I thought we could essentially repeatedly broadcast the buffer, and everybody could just grab it when they wanted. But I think I'm satisfied now that my student probably knows more than I do about how to make this work efficiently. This idea of a lazy update versus a continuous stream seems to make sense. It's open source, and we can put a little VNC server on anybody's machine that lets them grab and capture. So that's the basic implementation. The student software then is they've got this connection. They can display or zoom, as I've mentioned. They can capture, as I've talked about. They can do annotations. They can go into the presentation mode if they're allowed to, which means they then go into being the presenter. They can leave that, and they can I'll also allow the instructor to look at their machine in the instructor mode wants to see how you or you solved this particular problem. If you block yourself out, the instructor will know you've locked out, but it won't see what's going on in your machine. So if you're shy or reluctant, in fact, I've found it interesting teaching with students and having access online, and especially I run online office hours at most hours of the evening till about midnight, especially when I give homework problems that I thought I knew how to work, but when the students start working them, I'm not so sure. And they start asking me questions, and I say, that's a good question. I haven't thought of it that way. So then I'm interacting and answering. Well, I think I get more office hours by internet than I do by my door being open. And maybe it's the time of day, maybe it's the mode. Anyway, that's another. So this is my fancy room. We called it the Simularium because I'm doing simulations, and it seemed like a nice word, and so far I haven't found that it's copyrighted by anybody else. But so I have a 100-seat lab. It's I am popular in that mode, in that my colleagues find this room to be nice. Some are a little shocked when there's no whiteboards and blackboards allowed. So if you can't work at a document camera, or you can't work from a presentation of a tablet PC, you're not going to be comfortable there. But the ability to have a 100-seat nice room available on short notice for something gets some of them over that. Most of them, it's become rather popular. So that's where we have. I've mentioned that to you. And for our future work is obviously to see if we can make this really work in a way that's compelling to other people than me. And we're trying to be flexible, because I recognize that some people like to work from their laptop or their tablet, and that's just fine. And we're using Presenter, that'll work well. I'm also the document camera is supported and will be supported better as we get this software so we can grab the data stream. But right now we're using a document camera, and I like that better. In fact, I'm thinking that when I just taught computer networks, and it's a computer architecture of networks, and I had a lot of PowerPoint slides because there's a lot of complexity, and I couldn't write all that stuff out in real time. But if I could use the paper copy of those on the document camera and then make my annotations and my notations, I find that more comfortable. Again, with the ability that I'm standing here writing, looking at the reaction I'm getting from my students, not looking at the board, looking over my shoulder at the board, but it's all in front of me. I think that's effective for me. But I'm trying to make some flexibility. I'm not trying to make everybody buy exactly my architecture. I'm just trying to make the general notion of having this large space where there's ability to see more than just the immediate presentation and all the other things I've talked about. So we're going to be using this in a trial way in a programming class. Professor McDowell is going to be teaching in this room this fall, and who's teaching the introductory programming class, and Charlie and I will try to make some of this work, at least for some of his problem sessions. We think there's a lot of potential here for making a large class a much more enjoyable and educational experience than they typically are. And I've got kids who've just been through college, and they tell me those are dismal to sit in a large lecture. You might as well stayed home and just taped it. I think that's a terrible indictment of I'd hate to think my students feel that way about my classes. If I can't get, if there's something so impersonal that you just as well record it, then I think we're doing it wrong. We might as well record it and deliver it to them that way. Simulations, I've given you my commercial and my values on that. The sharing of work, we get scared of that word sharing, it's like copying, but I really mean that I think students do learn together, and I think you learn from each other. And one of the dilemmas I think we still have in education is how to balance between how they can learn from each other and how we can judge their individual work. I'm not going to get into that one here, but that's a challenge. And redirect the student attention from in-class note-taking to learning and comprehension. That's the grand dream. So I'm through with my commercial and my perspective of why this is worthwhile to me. I'm glad to, and I will also confess that I feel the biggest weakness in my work here is I don't have any really convincing means of evaluation. I'm getting student feedback with enthusiasm. I have volunteers of students who want to come help me make it better. That's a nice testimonial. The teaching evaluations tell me that the students like the ideas and like to have more of it. But if I were to present this as a paper in the journal, I've got to evaluate it. But I don't know how to take a class and run it the old way and this way separately. So if anybody wants to partner with me on figuring out how to make this stuff really work in a way but be convincing about how you can prove its worth, I'm somewhat at a loss there. Some days I'd say I don't care, but I do care. I just don't know how. So that's one piece of discussion that I'd be delighted to have with some people who know more about that than I. I'm an engineer. I like to build systems. I don't know exactly how you quantify the impact. Any professors in the crowd that tell me how wrong I am, or where I need to change, or what I ought to have, or yes but, or any of you that I'm more than interested in feedback.
I have a regular question.
Okay, that's all right. That's okay.
In the previous talk, there was some discussion on sort of dissenters, people who sort of have a strong feeling.
You don't get the sense that I have any of those?
I'm talking about your students now. So with respect to your students who have viewed the class materials in this format and have this interaction, what are the strong opinions that are adverse to the teaching?
I haven't gotten any really adverse ones. I've had more adverse ones from faculty who say, well, if you do all this for them this way and you record it all, why did they come to class? And I think that's the most adverse reaction I've had, and that fortunately is from a very small segment of faculty. I think for students what I've had is it isn't all working right. There's glitches. I've used it out there on the bleeding edge of things that aren't really quite ready, but we used them anyway. And so, and they're not complaints, they're more laments that, it'd be nice if you didn't have to spend time making that work, or stopping and rebooting that system, or waiting for your graduate student to make this or that go. I've gotten other I haven't. The course I taught the previous time, I think, was also a networks course, and I had used Conference XP, and I had recorded all these on a server. And I was interested in how students that I thought might have missed a class or something would use it. And I asked the students, and they said, oh, yeah, we're all using that. And they basically said, yeah. And I said, well, what are you doing? You just go into a segment that you get when you get stuck on a homework problem, you go back and find where I talked about that. He said, no, a lot of times we watch the whole lecture over. I was kind of surprised. In fact, I'm a little bothered by that because it seems a little inefficient. But they felt that when they were reviewing material, they could sit and just replay the video stream at home and watch the lecture again. I don't think they're that good that you want to watch them twice myself. I was looking for the fact that you could go to the chart, the slide that I had, and listen to the audio that went with that and get that concept cleared up and move on. So I'm learning from things that I don't quite like in that sense, but I'm surprised at that answer. But the overall student reaction has been, give us more. And The only reaction I did get was when she gave us those notes beforehand. I said, because I just finished them about 10 minutes before class. That's why. No lying here. I mean, I just made it just in time. I changed the lecture on the way in. I thought of an idea when I drove in, and I went in and changed the notes. It's expensive. That's one piece.
I think we need to
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could.
I'm